In a quiet corner of Fort Rucker, Alabama, under a maintenance hangar roof where southern humidity slowly wages war against aluminum and steel, sits a helicopter that once rewrote the rules of modern air combat. Its olive drab paint is faded and uneven, corrosion scars sanded down and primed but never fully restored, as if history itself was left half-finished. Beneath the pilot's door are 5 small red stars, modest and almost easy to miss. They do not shout. They do not boast. But each one marks a confirmed kill during 14 nights in February 1991, when this AH-64 Apache, Bureau number 88-0426, helped dismantle an air defense network that military doctrine had declared untouchable. The official tally painted on the fuselage is conservative. Battalion records credit the aircraft with involvement in engagements accounting for portions of at least 9 ZSU-23-4 self-propelled anti-aircraft systems, along with radar sites and hardened gun positions. You cannot stencil fractions onto an airframe, so 5 stars became the compromise between paperwork and reality. I stood beside this helicopter in 2019 while a staff sergeant explained that it had not flown since 2003. Transmission wear limits, funding priorities, the quiet mathematics of peacetime budgets. Now students remove its panels and inspect hydraulic lines as part of maintenance training. The Hellfire rails are empty. The 30mm chain gun hangs inert, feed system disconnected and tagged INOP in bright red. It is difficult to reconcile this silent instructional tool with what it once represented. Delivered new to Fort Rucker in 1988 and assigned to 1st Battalion, 101st Aviation Regiment, 88-0426 rotated through crews during workups before deploying to Saudi Arabia in August 1990. The intelligence briefings there painted a grim picture. Iraqi air defenses were described as a layered nightmare. Soviet doctrine executed with Soviet hardware by an army hardened through 8 years of war with Iran. Overlapping radar coverage, mobile gun systems, surface-to-air missile batteries positioned to cover one another's engagement envelopes. The manuals were clear. Helicopters were not to penetrate such systems. Suppression was the job of wild weasel aircraft and artillery. Only after the umbrella collapsed would attack helicopters exploit gaps and hunt armor. That was theory. At 0400 on February 24, 1991, 88-0426 crossed into Iraq at 50 feet above the desert floor in total darkness as part of a deep strike package aimed directly at an air defense network assumed safe from rotary-wing attack. Thermal sights pierced the night while Iraqi crews trusted distance, doctrine, and reputation to shield them. They were wrong. Over the next 14 days, Apache battalions conducted repeated low-level penetrations that dismantled radar nodes, shredded gun systems, and forced crews to abandon equipment in place. The numbers in the after-action reports do not align perfectly. Different commands counted differently. But when battalion logs are cross-referenced with core intelligence summaries, one figure appears with stubborn consistency. Approximately 200 Iraqi air defense systems destroyed or abandoned in 2 weeks. Helicopters achieved what planners once insisted required fixed-wing suppression. To understand why this was so shocking, you have to understand the architecture of Soviet integrated air defense doctrine. It was engineered vertically. Radar arrays scanned upward in overlapping cones designed to detect bombers and diving fighter bombers. Gun systems were optimized for targets descending from altitude. Missile batteries like the SA-6 and SA-8 were positioned to extend engagement ranges against threats above the horizon. Iraq purchased the full package and deployed it according to the textbook. What the textbook did not adequately address was a disciplined force flying nap-of-the-earth profiles beneath radar lobes, exploiting terrain masking even in open desert, coordinating precision Hellfire strikes against emitters before those emitters understood they were targeted. The SA-9 Gaskin and SA-13 Gopher formed the outer skin of Iraq's point defense layer, mobile, infrared-guided, designed to swat down aircraft slipping through higher-altitude missile envelopes. Beneath them, Anchoring the network in steel and radar energy sat the ZSU-23-4 Shilka, four 23mm cannons mounted on a tracked chassis, tied to the distinctive gun dish radar that could track through evasive maneuvers and dust haze. On paper, the Shilka was a predator built for the exact mission the Apaches were about to attempt. Its combined rate of fire reached roughly 3,400 rounds per minute, a dense stream of high-explosive projectiles capable of shredding aluminum in seconds. Official effective range against aircraft was listed at 2,500 meters, but that figure assumed the target behaved like doctrine predicted, approaching at altitude, descending into engagement envelopes, remaining within radar geometry optimized for vertical tracking. The system had entered Soviet service in 1965, specifically to counter low-altitude strike aircraft, and it proved its worth during the 1973 Yom Kippur War, when Israeli pilots learned quickly that flying low no longer meant flying safe. American intelligence analysts dissected those engagements in detail, concluding that radar-directed anti-aircraft artillery made traditional low-level attack profiles extremely hazardous. By 1990, Iraq possessed hundreds of Shilkas, positioned to protect supply corridors, command posts, artillery groupings, and forward operating bases. U.S. Central Command's pre-war assessments described the Iraqi Integrated Air Defense Network as the most sophisticated structure American forces had confronted since Vietnam, arguably more modern, with newer equipment and years of instruction from Soviet advisors who trained Iraqi officers in mutual support positioning, radar discipline, mobility techniques, and emission control designed to frustrate anti-radiation missiles. On paper, it was disciplined, layered, and lethal. The 101st Aviation Brigade absorbed those intelligence packets for months before Desert Storm. Terrain models mapped likely gun sites. Electronic warfare studies outlined radar coverage arcs. Attrition projections for helicopter strikes against prepared defenses ran between 15% and 20%, figures extrapolated from theoretical NATO Warsaw Pact scenarios in Europe. The uncomfortable truth was that no one had ever tested attack helicopters against a fully operational Soviet-style network at scale. Inside brigade headquarters, the doctrinal debate sharpened. Some officers argued that helicopters should wait for the Air Force to open corridors, allowing F-16s and F-15Es to dismantle the worst of the defenses first. Others countered that delay ceded initiative and allowed Iraqi units to reposition into stronger configurations. The compromise was bold. Deep penetration strikes at night, exploiting darkness and terrain masking, with Apaches flying at approximately 50 feet above the desert floor, using thermal sights to acquire targets before Iraqi crews could react. Soviet doctrine assumed attackers from above. Iraqi gunners trained to elevate barrels and scan upward. A helicopter at 50 feet moving at 120 knots presented a tracking challenge those systems were not optimized to solve. The theory held together in briefing rooms. Whether it would survive contact with hundreds of radar-guided guns operated by experienced crews was unknown until the early hours of February 24th, when 88-0426 and 30 other Apaches crossed into Iraq toward defenses widely considered impenetrable. Underpinning the argument was air-land battle doctrine, crafted in the 1980s after the Army spent a decade absorbing the lessons of Vietnam and studying Soviet operational art. The concept envisioned deep strikes against reserves and logistics, while forward units fixed the enemy in place. Helicopters were central, fast, lethal, able to exploit opportunities created by combined arms maneuver. Doppler processing was designed to solve one problem and unintentionally created another. By filtering out low-velocity returns to eliminate ground clutter, the ZSU-23-4's radar essentially trained itself to ignore anything moving too slowly relative to the Earth. A helicopter creeping at 50 feet, sometimes reducing speed to 40 knots during a firing setup, blended into the noise floor of the battlefield. On the operator's scope, it resembled shifting terrain rather than a threat. By the time Iraqi crews transitioned from radar ambiguity to visual confirmation, the geometry favored the attacker. Engagement windows collapsed to seconds. And this is where the story shifts from tactics to bureaucracy. The Army knew from classified National Training Center exercises that night, Nap-of-the-earth Apaches could survive against radar-directed guns at rates far better than Cold War attrition models predicted. But those results remained compartmented. Publicly validating them would strengthen the Army Aviation Branch's argument for deep independent operations, an argument the Air Force viewed as encroachment into air interdiction territory. Budget lines, procurement priorities, doctrinal ownership. These were not abstract debates, but institutional survival questions. When planners from the 101st briefed Central Command on deep helicopter strikes against Iraqi air defenses, objections from Air Force representatives centered less on feasibility than precedent. If this worked, it would redefine roles. The compromise imposed restrictive coordination measures. Apaches could strike, but only within pre-designated boxes, during assigned windows, sequenced through the air tasking order. No autonomous hunter-killer sweeps beyond fixed parameters. On paper, that preserved joint structure. In practice, it nearly strangled the concept. Air tasking order cycles ran 72 hours. Any target requiring formal deconfliction could take 3 days from identification to clearance. Iraqi units displaced roughly every 48 hours. The timeline mismatch was obvious. What altered the outcome was an officer at Corps headquarters whose name remains elusive in declassified archives. Multiple FOIA attempts yield redacted references. An Army Heritage Center researcher once described the role as administratively sensitive, which in military language often means someone bent process without breaking command intent. This lieutenant colonel reportedly engineered an approval mechanism that satisfied doctrinal boundaries on paper while granting battalion commanders practical autonomy to engage time-sensitive targets. It was bureaucratic fiction of the most elegant kind, preserving institutional narratives while enabling operational reality. When 88-0426 crossed into Iraq, its Hellfires came from a production batch expedited through acceptance testing for the deployment. Some missiles would not receive formal full combat-ready designation until March, yet they were loaded, armed, and trusted. At 0447 on February 24th, the first ZSU-23-4 of the campaign was destroyed. A Charlie Company crew detected its thermal signature at roughly 3,200 meters. The gun system sat hull down behind a berm shielding an artillery battery. Its radar was in standby, an intelligent choice to minimize electromagnetic exposure and avoid anti-radiation targeting. That discipline offered no protection against a laser-guided Hellfire launched from a platform the crew never visually acquired. Missile time of flight was approximately 11 seconds. The warhead penetrated the turret, igniting onboard ammunition. The secondary explosion scattered 23mm rounds across a 40-meter radius. The artillery battery behind it began immediate displacement, abandoning several pieces. Intelligence later assessed that the destruction of that single Shilka effectively suppressed an entire battalion's fire support capability. By 0630 hours, Charlie Company confirmed 6 ZSU kills. Alpha Company added 4. Bravo Company secured 3 more before daylight forced relocation to refueling points. They did not destroy 2 gun systems that morning. They destroyed 5. Thermal resolution at range had merged signatures into what looked like a pair of targets, but as the Hellfires arced in, the bloom separated into distinct vehicles. 5 ZSU-23-4 Shilkas, positioned close enough that their heat signatures overlapped at distance, all actively scanning with gun dish radar. All 5 died without successfully acquiring the Apaches as firing solutions. Iraqi doctrine emphasized radar discipline to survive against anti-radiation missiles, so crews were conditioned to limit emissions until threats were confirmed. The flaw lay in threat recognition. Their systems were tuned to track jet aircraft, fast, high, predictable in vector. The Apaches' returns were anomalous. Too slow, too low, too close to ground clutter. It is plausible that some operators saw the returns and dismissed them as vehicles or spurious echoes. By the close of February 26th, The battalion confirmed 47 air defense kills in 72 hours. Corps Intelligence revised its sector estimate upward by roughly 60%, not because reconnaissance had failed to count systems, but because analysts had not believed Iraqi commanders would push that many assets so far forward. The density of targets exceeded planning assumptions. Paradoxically, that density created opportunity. As forward gun systems disappeared, Iraqi air defense commanders shifted units from depth positions to reinforce the areas they assumed faced the main effort. That assumption proved lethal. Helicopters were not massing along predictable corridors. They were dispersing across a 40-kilometer frontage, operating in pairs and small teams, striking from shifting vectors in darkness against crews scanning for aircraft that never arrived. Signals intelligence summaries beginning February 27th referenced intercepts from Iraqi tactical frequencies. The declassified translations are clinical, stripped of tone, but the operational picture they sketch suggests disorientation. One controller attempted to vector a Shilka platoon toward a reported helicopter location, based on a transmission from a gun system that had ceased broadcasting 40 seconds before detonation. By the time movement orders were processed, the Apaches were kilometers away. Another intercept records a battalion-level air defense commander requesting updated threat axis information from division headquarters. Division could not provide it. The attacks lacked a linear pattern. Iraqi doctrine was structured around defending against air corridors, anticipated approach paths for fixed-wing aircraft. Instead, engagements appeared episodic and spatially unpredictable. Some Iraqi units attempted constant displacement between firing points to complicate targeting. Mobility, however, imposed setup delays. Gun dish radars required calibration time for optimal tracking performance. Other units remained static with continuous emissions, preserving radar readiness but increasing electromagnetic exposure and shortening their survivability once located. Attribution within publicly available intercept documentation remains incomplete. The National Security Agency released analytical summaries rather than full transcripts. Recordings themselves remain classified. Some exchanges are tied to identifiable Iraqi formations. Others are labeled generically as enemy air defense frequency without unit specificity. Multiple intelligence summaries reference confusion within Iraqi networks. Yet only 3 discrete translated exchanges appear in the open record. That is an assessment, not a comprehensive dataset. Caution is warranted when inferring systemic collapse from fragmentary intercepts filtered through classification layers designed to protect collection methods. Correlation is clearer than causation. Iraqi air defense effectiveness degraded noticeably after February 26th. Coinciding with sustained Apache pressure and the removal of forward radar-directed guns. What is firmly documented is the shift in Iraqi behavior. Before February 27th, reconnaissance and signals reporting consistently showed ZSU-23-4 crews holding prepared positions with radars radiating. After February 27th, imagery and electronic surveillance recorded a measurable change, increased displacement, intermittent emissions, and in some sectors, complete radar silence. Thermal sweeps began revealing gun systems sitting cold in revetments, engines shut down, no crew activity nearby. In several cases, vehicles were simply abandoned in firing positions, hatches open, as if the crews had stepped away and never returned. Soviet doctrine had prepared Iraqi officers to counter coordinated daylight strike packages approaching along predictable axes. The Apaches were operating outside that template. They arrived singly or in pairs, at night, from shifting vectors. Inside the vertical geometry, the system was optimized to defend. Iraqi air defense was not annihilated by mass bombardment. It was functionally bypassed by exploiting the engagement assumptions embedded in its design. Once commanders grasped the pattern, many crews were already casualties or had chosen survival over position. Night operations accelerated the imbalance. The AN/ASQ-170 target acquisition and designation site gave Apache crews thermal clarity that transformed darkness into asymmetry. Against the cold desert floor, engines glowed. Recently fired barrels radiated heat. Even camouflage netting retained enough thermal differential to betray concealment at several kilometers. A Bravo Company pilot described it in a 1992 Army Aviation Digest interview as hunting, not combat. We'd fly search patterns at 50 feet, and the TADs would light up targets we didn't know existed. It stopped feeling like fighting and started feeling like we were collecting things. That language is revealing, not triumphal, but clinical. Between March 1st and March 7th, cumulative kills entered triple digits. Some aircraft flew 3 sorties within 24 hours. Launch at dusk, hunt for hours, refuel and rearm. Launch again after 0200. Forward arming and refueling point crews operated at a tempo that would have violated peacetime maintenance regulations. Crew chiefs logged 18-hour days sustaining mission-capable rates under combat pressure. A March 4th maintenance entry for tail number 88-0419 records return from sortie with a hydraulic leak, cracked windscreen, and navigation fault. Assessment, Code 2, degraded but combat flyable. That helicopter launched again 6 hours later. The notation appears in a lessons learned annex on maintenance under operational stress. It connects to nothing else, yet it illustrates the environment. Systems were imperfect, crews were exhausted, and operations continued regardless. By early March, target scarcity, not attrition, logistics, or crew endurance, became the primary constraint. Reconnaissance flights increasingly located abandoned or withdrawn Shilkas. Some Apache teams extended search patterns northward seeking viable targets. Coordination friction resurfaced. Restrictive fire areas intended to prevent fratricide limited helicopter freedom of maneuver. Crews would identify radar-directed gun signatures 20 kilometers beyond assigned sectors and request clearance. Approval delays often rendered engagements moot as Iraqi units displaced. On March the 6th, 4 Apaches from Charlie Company engaged what they assessed as 2 ZSU-23-4s shielding a logistics convoy. After destroying the gun systems, crews continued engagement, eliminating 14 trucks and multiple support vehicles. Gun camera footage documented secondary detonations consistent with munitions transport. The after-action report categorized it as an air defense mission expanding into interdiction. No reprimands followed. Operational tempo had surpassed procedural rigidity. Battalion commanders effectively empowered crews to prosecute targets justified within tactical context. The official brigade total reads 207 Iraqi air defense systems destroyed or captured between February 24th and March 10th. The internal breakdown lists 142 ZSU-23-4 Shilkas, 38 SA-9 Gaskin launchers, 19 SA-13 Gopher launchers, plus radar nodes and static gun positions. Core Intelligence published 189. Their methodology excluded equipment found abandoned but intact, counting only systems visibly destroyed on gun camera footage or later confirmed by ground inspection teams. The gap between 207 and 189 is not clerical error. It is definitional friction. What constitutes destruction in modern war? An SA-9 left in revetment with its missiles removed and crew gone. Neutralized but structurally intact. Does it qualify? A Shilka penetrated by a Hellfire that disables turret rotation and fire control but does not produce a catastrophic ammunition cook-off. Functionally dead, visually ambiguous. How is that recorded? Aviation units credited any engaged system that ceased operating. Intelligence analysts credited only what could be confirmed through imagery or physical verification. Some targets were never revisited because the ground campaign advanced too rapidly to sweep every engagement site. Duplication added another variable. One Apache team strikes a radar-directed gun, flames visible. A second team, operating nearby, observes the burning vehicle and reports it separately. Operations officers reconciled timestamps and grid references to remove duplicates. Most were likely caught. Absolute certainty is unattainable. The figure that survives comparative scrutiny across reports, applying the strictest criteria, hovers around 200 systems definitively destroyed by Apache-launched weapons during the 2-week period dedicated to air defense suppression. That number is conservative enough to withstand cross-examination and large enough to alter doctrine. Yet the arithmetic understates the operational cascade. Each destroyed Shilka forced Iraqi commanders to redistribute surviving assets to cover emerging gaps. Redistribution weakened radar overlap and created exposure elsewhere. Soviet air defense theory anticipated attrition rates of roughly 15 to 20% while maintaining functional integration. In several sectors, Iraqi forward-deployed systems suffered losses exceeding 60%. At that threshold, the architecture ceased behaving as an integrated network and devolved into isolated units defending themselves without mutual support. The collapse was systemic rather than purely numerical. There is also an uncounted margin. Improvised anti-aircraft guns mounted on trucks, heavy machine guns positioned in defensive clusters, quad 23mm mounts not formally catalogued as designated systems. Apache crews engaged and eliminated many of these threats, yet they remain absent from official suppression totals because they did not meet classification criteria. The conservative 200 excludes them. What remains indisputable is that over 14 nights, a helicopter battalion operated inside an integrated air defense structure widely assessed as prohibitive and reduced it below functional coherence. Iraqi officers were not untrained. They understood Soviet theory intimately, possessed modern equipment, and had years of combat experience from the Iran-Iraq War. Their network failed not from incompetence, but from encountering a threat profile outside its design assumptions. Helicopters flying at 50 feet, at night, employing thermal sensors and precision-guided munitions that negated the vertical engagement geometry their systems were engineered to exploit. Doctrine did not anticipate that combination of altitude, darkness, and autonomy. The lessons were not immediately codified in public manuals, nor were inter-service debates erased overnight. Institutional inertia persists. But the empirical record from late February and early March 1991 forced a recalibration in how rotary-wing aviation was viewed in deep operations.